You ready?
Ready.
All right, let's do it. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am thrilled to have back Lisa Danylchuk. Lisa, welcome back.
Woo! Thank you. So good to be back, Guy.
So as most of you know, Lisa is an author, a licensed psychotherapist, and founder of the Center for Yoga and Trauma Recovery, also creator of the Yoga for Trauma program. Graduate of UCLA and Harvard University, her work has pioneered the field of trauma-informed yoga and transformed our understanding of embodiment practices and therapeutic work. More than 300 providers from 25 plus countries have completed her Yoga for Trauma online training program, the first virtual program to train providers offering yoga for trauma recovery.
Yeah, no, it's like 450 countries. So I gotta update that. Yeah. Exciting.
450 countries. She serves on the board and as UN committee co-chair for the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. She's written for publications like Good Therapy and the American Psychological Association. Her books include Embodied Healing, Using Yoga to Recover from Trauma and Extreme Stress, also How You Can Heal, a Strength-Based Guide to Trauma Recovery, and Yoga for Trauma Recovery, Theory, Philosophy, and Practice. Lisa, welcome back.
Thank you. And that last book is on Audible now, which I'm super excited about. And I just finished serving as president of ISSTD last year. So I need to update my bio. Apologies.
Damn. So crazy bio. Congrats.
Thank you. It's good times. It's good times. And as you know, I'm, currently in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy and about to lean out pretty hard. So it feels good to have done some things and to be doing some other things.
That's awesome. Well, look, let me just get right to the point. I invited you back here. You have such a great energy and you just such a positive, healing vibe, if I can use that term, that I just love talking to you and loved having you back on the podcast. So wanted to bring you back and excited you're here.
Love it. And you're on episode like 400, 500. Where are we in space now? Thousands.
700 something.
700.
Yeah.
I think our first one was like 12 or 33 or something really early.
Crazy
so
back.
It's great to be back and to have been along for the ride. And it's great to see all you've done. It's amazing.
Appreciate that. So I know we have a couple things, you'd mentioned a couple things you want to talk about, but let's jump if we can. I want to jump to your podcast.
Yeah.
And remind people what the name of it is.
How We Can Heal.
Okay. So before you talk about what you want to talk about, I want to ask you in first of all, share why you started the podcast. And then I'm curious about how things have unfolded for you in terms of what you've learned about, not just about creating a podcast, but in terms of your healing in general and your goal for starting the podcast, how that has unfolded for you.
So much to say. So interrupt me anytime. So, I could go off. So I never actually had it in my mind to start a podcast. And when I met Alex, my partner, about 8 years ago, he was like, you should start a podcast. He was very into listening to podcasts and I was minimally so. And then over time, I think you offered a, podcast for mental health professionals training. And around that time that you offered that, I was starting to like the seed he had planted was starting to sink in. Like, maybe I would enjoy that. I really love having conversations with people. I love going on other people's podcasts. So that started to take root. I think I did the training program you did. And then it was still like, this was probably 2020, 2021, where like there was so much upheaval going on. I was like, I don't think I can take on that project just yet. And then a little more time. And then I felt ready. And I had like a training session with the woman who was the first guest on my podcast. I don't know if I think she might've been on yours too, Gabby Bernstein. And she's like, I feel like you should do a podcast just intuitively. I feel like you'd be really good and I feel like you should do a podcast. And I was like, oh, that's really funny because I've started brainstorming. I have a note in my phone and a list of guests and you're on that list. And she's like, great, let's do it. You'll be episode 1. And I was like, oh, okay, action mode. So that's how it started in a practical sense. And I think the yearning of what we can talk about or what I want to bring to that show is there's so much trauma we're processing collectively. And I think we're becoming more aware that that's also what's happening and calling it trauma, which is huge. But as you and I know, we can also get really lost in trauma. We can also get really submerged by it, right? To the point where it feels hard to find ground or hard to find land or hard to see, well, what does healing even look like or feel like? You know, maybe we're sort of grasping at straws or grasping for a life raft and trying to find some semblance of steadiness to move forward. And I feel like collectively that's part of where we're at, right?
When you say, if I may, when you say submerged by trauma, do you mean submerged by the information and what it means? And oh my God, this is trauma and that's trauma. Say more about that. What do you mean by that?
Both. I think actually we're submerged by, or we're processing or attempting to process the impacts of trauma. And I'm talking about systemic trauma, colonialism, racism, like these bigger, they're personal, but they're also societal and interpersonal, right? So, you know, you and I have been in a million trainings and probably taught this ourselves too a million times. If there's acute stress, post-traumatic stress, complex trauma, developmental trauma, and then we could go into all these other, you know, traumatic loss or betrayal trauma. There's all these different terms we use and angles to understand. And I think like so many of those are up in the collective right now. And of course we see through filters when we're online and social media because of our interaction there. But I see a lot of people trying to process through things. And I see it through a clinical lens, right? Like I'm used to sitting with one or two people and working through something that's a little more constrained to one person's life and all the layers that entails. But I just feel like it's happening in a bigger way and people are getting more curious about trauma. So yes, to your point, there is also this like trauma, right? Like this is what it is, and this is what it isn't, and this is my opinion, and this is how you regulate your nervous system, and so again, in my world, when I log in online, that's what I see. And so my hope with the podcast is, yes, like, and I intentionally didn't name it, you know, Trauma Informed Podcast, because I'm like, well, where are we going? Like what's our anchor that's not in the trauma vortex, that's in a healing vortex, or that what's something we can move in the direction of that feels better. And so the word, you know, healing comes to mind, and I don't even know, like, you know, with names, it's not always quite perfect, but like how can we heal? Like how, and I see from a clinical lens, I've seen people move through really gnarly trauma and build lives that entail joy and pleasure and all these positive things when maybe at a time in life that felt inaccessible. So I feel like there's a broad path there and many avenues within, like if we use the mountain analogy, many paths up the mountain. And I want to talk about what's working. I want to talk about what's helping, without denying this is really gnarly. This is really hard. And without denying the fact that we can dissociate when things get really gnarly and really hard, and that's adaptive, and that's a great skill or tool to have for a moment, but for a lifetime, it can also distance us from that joy, right? So all of that is how the podcast got started.
You mentioned dissociation, and we're going to come back to that. In terms of, as you've moved forward, and now you're starting season 3.
Yeah.
To start. Okay. As you stated all that, what has come up for you? What have you learned in terms of that? What's maybe been a surprise for you? And I'm interested in what some things your guests have shared that have really snapped things for you.
So many things, as you know, having hosted now 700 episodes, there's little moments in all of them for sure. And I think of like different worlds coming together in terms of maybe spirituality and yoga and meditation and healing and this clinical knowledge, right? Because I've interviewed people who, you know, are professors and are doing research and have been doing research, you know, almost in the shadows from the larger standpoint
Mm-hmm.
on this stuff for many, many years. And then I've also interviewed people who have millions of followers and are out there, offering support and advice to people who are hurting. And so I feel like there's a coming together of that's happening. There's more connection between the worlds, which is beautiful. And the episodes that stand out to me as you ask that question, the first two are Jennifer Fried and Institutional Courage, because I think that's a huge part of our collective healing right now is organizations and institutions doing hard work to just evolve and be responsive to trauma when and how they can. And I know from being president of an international organization that's hard,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that involves a
Mm-hmm.
lot of moving pieces and people and cultures and processes. And the idea is so much clearer than the action, but the action is also so important. So that stands out. And then the other piece that stands out a lot, I think just being in the US and the history of the US, but this is true in many places around the world, is the piece around race and healing in terms of, the US history with slavery and oppression and colonialism. So Dr. Heather Hall's episode stands out where she talks about schizophrenia and dissociation and how, how those two can get conflated. She's done some amazing work in that area and others. And Dr. Jennifer Gomez, her episode stands out around cultural betrayal trauma. She's worked with Dr. Jennifer Fried. But towards the end, this is a teaser because it's coming out in season 3. We talked about a concept she brought called dream storming, which very much aligns with what I just described in terms of my hopes for the How We Can Heal podcast, which is like, can we envision what if this were solved? Let's just go way out there and let ourselves go out there. Like, let us go utopian and just dream. And then slowly trickle back at some point, like where are there threads that we can pull, or where are there paths we can walk that connect us to that? Again, so we have a sense of anchor in something positive. And even though it might be a dream, again, we thread back, like where does that dream have some little tendril of a root in reality and today even? And that I think is really powerful.
I love that. I mean, that's so positive. I immediately thought of, my own experience, and I'm going through something, and when it first hit, which I mean, I've talked about it, divorce, but when that first hit, I was like, how do you heal? What do you do?
Yeah.
Even though you might be aware of all these modalities and ways, it's like, what am I supposed to do? And that whole, it becomes very, there were times when I was thinking, wait, am I doing this right? I'm not doing this right. And, but, to hear you talk, you're talking about these large, major, global universal issues that are at once really exciting, and on the other side of it, kind of daunting. But we need to have those discussions because you're bringing this awareness to it, this light to it, and also this possibility and hope as well.
Which I think we need. And, being a guest on the podcast as well, I always end with like, what brings you hope? Because in the mess of it, like when you're in that throes of, the early impacts of divorce, of loss, of a pandemic, of, and, anything that really shakes us and stirs up our sense of maybe mortality or expectation of life, like we're in a really vulnerable state at that point. And it can be, again, that sort of tsunami of emotion and upheaval and change. And so having some little thread, finding at some point, it might not come right away, but finding like, well, what does bring me hope? And that might be connection with a child. That might be looking up at the sky, on a moment to moment or daily or whatever basis. I know nature is really big for me. So sometimes it is as simple as like seeing a blossom on a tree, and then whatever else is happening, I just take a moment and I take a breath, and it's like, okay, the trees seem to keep blooming after every season. Like this has been
Mm-hmm.
going on for a long time
Right.
through a lot of wars and a lot of things, right? Pandemics. Okay, like there's some, and I get some little bit of hope in that. Like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
something's still working here. As
Right.
much as we maybe, exploited our planet environmentally or whatever, like you see a bee on a flower and you're like, oh, it's so vulnerable, but it's there. And so I think that hope is really important. And to your point, as a guest on the podcast, authenticity, right? So we're not like
Mm-hmm.
everything's so sunny and great while I'm going through this, really wretched divorce. Like that's not honest, right? And
Right.
we all know, and we might have to coach ourselves in different ways on different days, but the authenticity piece of what's really real for me in my life. And I think that whole energy describe of like, yeah, let's look at these gnarly things, but let's also not get taken down by them. That's been very real for me. So
Mm-hmm. I think too for a lot of people, and I think it's becoming maybe more understood now, but just the word trauma. I mean, that in and of itself um, really can take people back, can thwart them, and a lot of people do feel like, oh my God, this is happening. I don't know how to deal with that. That's that kind of initial shock. But I don't know. I think on the other side of it, this word healing is so charged. It means so much. It can to so many different people. Has that shifted for you? Has that changed for you, that definition of it? And if so, how?
yeah, great question. I feel like the word trauma being charged is real, right? Because we free associate the second we hear it, right? And so if there is some avoidance or denial or dissociation or suppression or repression or whatever going on, then it sort of sneaks in, right? We go
Mm-hmm.
trauma, like, that's too much for today, which by definition, right? It wouldn't be traumatic if it wasn't kind of too much. So I think that piece is very real, that even labeling it, talking about it, having it become a part of your work can sort of bring things up from
Mm-hmm.
from the soil or from the depths. And that kind of relates to dissociation too, that we start to knock on the door and we start to get curious and we go, oh, there's stuff there I wasn't aware of, via whatever process. And so healing, to me, I always think of this woman I met when I was teaching in Denmark. I want to say it was 2015. And she just shared after I taught a workshop on yoga and trauma. And she came up and she said, what really helped me was just remembering in those moments, in the thick of it, there is a way through. There's a way through this. There's a way. I don't know what it is, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna sniff it out, you know? And so that really resonated with me and my personal experiences, right, of traumatic loss and trauma in general too, is like, it's navigating and finding this way through. So when I think of healing, I think of so many different things, right? There's the reality of like we get a scrape in our body sort of without our thinking magically starts repairing
Mm-hmm.
it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
incredible. But then I was also thinking this morning while I was walking of, it's so hard to get like a tangible, visceral model of trauma that's like really you can hold in your hand. But when we get like a wound on our body, we'll get a scab and this sort of magical healing process that starts. But what if there's stuff in there? Like, what if there's gravel? What if there's, shrapnel? What if there's whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or bacteria or something in there where the healing process is just not quite going the way that your body was intending? Something
Mm-hmm.
else is stuck in there. We got to do something. And I think about that in terms of clinical interventions, in terms of, mental whole person health support. Sometimes as a therapist, you're kind of going in and going, oh, okay, there's something stuck in there. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
not going to be fun, or easy or graceful even, but we got to get it out, right? We got to find a way to not hurt you further and contain it and support it and be really skillful
Mm-hmm.
and look at the part that's causing that problem, whether it's a bacteria or a piece of something, and remove it, right? Slowly over time, with whatever supports are needed. So when I think of healing, I don't just think of what I always think of when someone asks me like graphic design things. I'm like, yellow, sunshine, nature, beautiful plants, sky. Like those are the things that come to my mind where I feel moments of peace, or I feel, whole or complete despite everything that's going on in life. But then I also think of this kind of, especially as someone who doesn't love blood, or, would never have been a surgeon in any other life, like this kind of gruesome process of like, let's really look at and get as clear as we can about what's problematic, treat that, care for it, and then support our whole system, whether that's a body or that's a community or that's a global society, like support that system in doing all the things it intuitively knows to do so well. Right. But sometimes we do. And sometimes, you're adding in good bacteria to balance out the other ones, but it's just this like systemic way that's also requires some skill, right? And some like, what is really hurting there? And what is, we look for this in EMDR and other things, like what is the belief? What is the moment? What are the things where something just stuck and it rewired, or it really resonated, and why? And like getting in there and figuring that out, and then knowing there is another way, I think that's really powerful.
I mean, it also speaks to the courage that's required to heal. I mean, getting in there and digging that stuff out, in a sense, it is painful, and it's hard. Healing is no joke,
takes so much energy.
It's crazy. And it's hard for me not to speak about this as I'm going through my own process, and someone, I have experience with this stuff and I'm aware of a lot of stuff, but still going through it, I was like, how the hell am I supposed to, what do I do?
Yeah.
What do not to mention dissociating.
Right.
I would find myself like driving and like see myself out here looking at myself going, oh my God, my life has just like,
I'm doing the thing that I've been talking about.
Yes.
It's me too. It's all of us, right?
Yeah. You had one of the things you said, two things I want to say here. I'm really curious about, as you've had all of these experiences, I mean, just reading through your bio, and now doing the podcast and having these amazing conversations with these incredible people, how your own idea, sense of yourself has shifted, or what have you learned about yourself and where you fit within your own process and your own calling, in a sense?
Well, such a good question. I feel like becoming a mom has been a big part of this journey too in the last year, and being pregnant and, being exposed to that world and the sort of birth education world too. And the first thing that comes to mind as you're asking is just honesty, because I've felt that weight of doing trauma work with trauma organizations and trauma, like the word being everywhere in my professional life, and feeling a little bit of discord with that, because I always give things the deathbed test at the end of my life. Like, do I want my life to be about trauma? No, like not necessarily. Do I believe it will have contained trauma? Yes. Like from my experience, 43 years old in 2 days, right? Like, yeah, it will have contained pain and loss and tragedy and trauma, but I don't want that to be the thing. And so I've been, slowing down and taking a pause. I finished my book in 2019, pandemic hit in 2020, all mental health professionals have been a little bit burnt out, was leading ISSTD in 2022, was also like planning a pregnancy. So trying to take care of my body. Right. So with all of that, and with thinking of, well, what do I want to pass down? I'm very lucky. I think you've had my mom on the show as well, and at Danylchuk, PhD, psychologist for 30 plus years working with dissociation and dissociative identity disorder. I got a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and not just that information about trauma, but I got this embodiment of care that was modeled, right? which not everyone gets, and I'm very grateful for. And just thinking consciously about, well, what do I want to pass down through my words, through my work, through my body, through the things I'm chewing on in my mind when we're quiet alone together as a family. And it's really not, healing is a piece of that, but there's more. There's enjoying life. There's pleasure in life. There's the truth that we're all interconnected. And, sometimes I hear people say, like, no one person can be well until we're all well. But I think that that's a little bit extreme, because when you look at a body, even all the cells in a body, there's things that are dying off. There's things that are being born. There's things that are changing and emerging. And so I get that perspective, but I also feel like it's really important for us to connect with that larger sense of interconnection, and to identify our uniqueness and our individuality and our capacity for choice, right? Our capacity for awareness and choice. And I want this baby in here to know that they have choice of what communities they interact with, what thoughts and feelings they agree are real, right? And to have that discernment to be able to continue to say, like, is this helping me? Is this serving me? So for my sort of place in my career at this point, it's become increasingly clear that I need to, for me to stay engaged and involved and have energy for this, I need to be speaking to joy. And laughter and play. And maybe that starts because I know when we're really mired in trauma, that stuff can feel far away. I think of like my first year after traumatic loss, and one my best friend that I've known my entire life, one day we were on the phone and she goes, "Oh, Wayne, you laughed. I haven't heard you laugh in so long." And I was like, really? I had no awareness of that, but that makes sense because I haven't really been in a laughing space for a while. So I'm not saying that we force these things, but that we hold them as part. Like, if we're going to do the work to look at the really gnarly scab and pull out the gravel, like, can we also hold this possibility for what we might call the other end of the spectrum, or just another experience of life, which is, oh my God, this guy is so beautiful right now, which is, I'm so grateful you're here with me in this moment, or however that shows up. So for me, I feel this lean towards speaking to possibility. I feel this lean towards, again, just being honest with like how the work has sort of rubbed up against me, and the moments that I've logged in online and seen conversations and been like, oh my God, are we still talking about this? And isn't there a better way? And isn't, like, I need to be honest about that and express that. And I feel like I'm right. The last year or so, I've noticed a lot of things coming up for myself in the work and in leadership positions that I'm like, oh, I feel like there's a better way. I don't know if I can communicate it quite yet, but I feel like right in the crux of that transition where, and it's interesting in learning about birth, really, and in learning about the physiology of birth and what impacts birth outcomes. It's really drawn things together for me, and like, okay, I'm getting this larger physiological picture. I'm getting this larger perspective on what happens when we're exposed to death or threatened death, PTSD definition, and what happens when we're exposed to birth and how those things interact. And so for me moving forward, it's just my goal, my plan is to just stay honest. And I think there's going to be more of me like drawing that line, that I've, weaving things together in the ways that I've seen it, and just holding space for all of it, but shifting a little more towards the end of the spectrum where it's like, we're going to be okay. Like,
yeah,
in some way, somehow, I might not be able to draw the whole map of it, but I think we got this.
I think that's really powerful, and I can hear your passion within that, and how you found that, how that's come about, how it's kind of emerged is so powerful. It just feels so authentic, and there's so much power in that. Like that's your power. That to hear that perspective is awesome.
Yeah, and I think of my own experiences, and there's definitely the point where you're in going through something really thick, really heavy, really intense or traumatic, and someone says something like, maybe go watch a movie, and you're like, oh my God, you totally missed, like, that's not going to help,
Mm-hmm.
or there's the Pollyanna side of it. And so being aware of that, having experienced that myself, right? But also being aware of the power of knowing someone, being in the presence of someone who has done the work that you're doing right now, that we continue to do throughout life at different moments of like, this sucks, this is hard, I feel myself dissociating, I'm going to find a way through. And however many days, weeks, months, years that takes, finding it that way through. And then just being with that person.
Right.
And sometimes it's something they say, and sometimes they do offer, a perspective or wisdom or something, but sometimes it's just them living their life as a model of like, it didn't stay that way forever, right? Something changed. And it is possible. And that's like an example of healing I might give,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's like, yeah, things were gnarly. And I always think of the Elizabeth Gilbert quote where she says, like, the women I look up to, it's not because shit worked out, it's because they handled it on different days in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. They showed up, right? They just kept showing
Mm-hmm.
up. And those kind of people, I'm lucky to have them in my life. And I would include you in on that as you're going through this, even, right? That it's like navigating and facing it in a way that then your whole vibe, right? Your whole life becomes a little more inclusive, a little more loving, a little more compassionate, maybe even a little softer, depending on the person and the experience. But there's just a sense of something there
Mm-hmm.
that those people have. And that's always been a comfort to me. So for me right now, remembering, oh, maybe 20 years ago when I was not laughing very often, there were people I met who didn't have to tell me their story, didn't have to explain the steps or the therapies they did, but just sort of showed up in a way that gave me some faith that life can contain all of this gnarliness and challenge and pain and difficulty, but that's not the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's more.
Intense, Lisa.
Is it? This is
Oh,
what I think about when I'm out on a walk in the morning.
it's so inspiring. I'm just imagining our listeners here, and um, I think you bring to the table a lot of experience and perspective and hope, which is so uh, powerful, but so needed in our lives right now. You know, my God. And what I think I'm really inspired by in what you're saying is your process of finding where your energy is going with all of this. There's trauma here, and yes, but there's all this joy and laughter here. And how are we bringing that into the conversation? So, as we kind of wind down here, um, again, your third season of your podcast, do you have a name for it, a title of it, a theme for it?
Well, the theme of the season is, so I listened to, like I said, I wasn't really into podcasts. There's one podcast that I listened to for a year straight, every episode, didn't miss a week. And then this person did an episode on PTSD. And I was so crestfallen, Guy. I was so disappointed by it that I've only listened to one other episode since. like, and I had actually reached out. I think I'm going to do an episode about this, so I don't mind saying it was the Huberman Lab podcast. And I had reached out preemptively, like, hey, because you start to get spidey senses of like, oh, I have a feeling this might be going in a direction that, I have thoughts about. So I reached out preemptively and sent, I think like initially 4 people's research, maybe up to like 8 people's research. Hey, if you're going to do an episode about post-traumatic stress, might want to look at Dr. Bethany Brand, Dr. Bethany Brand's work in dissociation. She's at Towson University. Lauren LeBois at Harvard Medical School, Melissa Kaufman with her, like Ruth Lanius, again, people you've had on your podcast, right? People who are looking at dissociation, intergenerational trauma, like more, I don't know, they're very steeped in that world, right? So it's not just like a overview of trauma and PTSD. It's much more depth. So I offered that, and it just became clear as I was listening to the episode that it wasn't factoring in what happens, with dissociation, which is now part of even in the DSM-5, DSM-5 TR. Like we have within the assessment for PTSD, or within the diagnosis for PTSD, we have a piece there, a mention of dissociative symptoms, right? So become more aware of dissociation as a response to trauma. But what I see that kind of lit a fire for me, and this won't be news to you, is how it's so easy for us to take interventions that are easy to measure and easy to research, easier than maybe more complex things, start to validate them, get excited about them, right? And then go, yay, this is best practice. Best practice is to, do CBT or do EMDR. And then I always think about the people that are excluded from those studies, because those are usually the people that I see in clinical practice, and most of the clinicians I know work with who have so many different diagnoses and who are working with complex trauma and developmental trauma and dissociative identity and things like that. So season 3, I'm on a little bit of a bender about, can we really incorporate dissociation into our understanding of trauma, particularly around treatment recommendations. I interviewed Megan Zippin, who was a Boston Marathon bombing survivor, foot on the finish line when the bombs went off in 2013 at the Boston Marathon. And this will be in season 3. She talks about, because it's the 10-year anniversary of the bombing. Can you believe it? She talks about going to EMDR because everyone said that's going to help. Dissociating more, like feeling like a failure because the thing that everyone says is going to help me isn't helping me. And the long-term struggle, 10 years out of coping with the PTSD from that experience, right? And the impacts on her life. Really profound and really moving. And the thing that I'm passionate about right now is to speak for what I would say are the people who have experienced the gnarliest trauma, like ritual abuse, sexual abuse, incest, terrorism, right? Like these things that luckily don't touch all of our lives, right? but are very real and are very complex and challenging even in terms of that treatment, right? Like if you think of it again from the medical tangible perspective, it's like something that, okay, this requires a team and we've got to figure this out and we've got to be very careful and very supportive. So I think about, with that podcast I was listening to in my disappointment, I think about the people who are listening all over the world who are really gnarly trauma survivors, who have experienced things like what Megan experienced, who've had responses in their body to trauma that 6 sessions of EMDR is not going to fix. If you've been in a car accident, 6 sessions of EMDR might do you really well. Right. Going home and telling your family about it might really help you. But if you were in combat and saw children killed, like going home and talking about it is probably not going to be the thing that makes you feel better. So like telling your story and doing these best evidence-based practices isn't always the path. And I think the sad thing is we do a service to the people who almost need the less amount of intervention or support because they're like, oh, I can do this. Great, done, check. And then that sort of reinforces this, oh, this is what works. Right. And then there's these people who are like, but that didn't work for me. And who very often then internalize, that didn't work for me. I must be wrong. I must be broken. I must have had something before this happened. Right. Or there must be something inherently wrong with me. Even what you're going through a divorce, and like, I would say that you're someone with a lot of psychological resources and, so many sort of internal and external assets or resilience scores going for you. 6 sessions of EMDR is not gonna, you know what I mean? Like, I would love to tell you that, guy. I'd love to be like, this thing I'm trained in, and I'll refer you to someone and bend, and you're gonna all better. But I just think, I think it's important that there's as much awareness out there, through your podcast, which does such a great service, through anyone who's having these conversations, to say it's okay if the gold standard isn't working for you. There's actually really good reason for that. We can talk about that reason. We can understand that reason, which is most of what I think season 3 will be about. But it's also just about offering support to folks who are in that camp, through maybe hearing Megan's experience and how her poetry's been really healing for her at this stage. And she just published a book that's coming out on the anniversary, through maybe understanding a little more about the neuroscience, right? Or through Jennifer Gomez's work around how culture plays in, all of these things. So I know I talk so much when you ask me one question.
It feels like, Lisa, is like you're putting a giant magnifying glass over how we're looking at trauma and PTSD and saying, wait a minute here, this needs to be explored a little more deeply. And wait a minute, look at this. Fascinating. All right, Lisa, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
I'm going to be on maternity leave, so psychic connections are probably the most effective. My website, howwecanheal.com, is probably the best way. I also have a website, lisadanylchuk.com. If you can spell it, you can get there. That's why howwecanheal.com started.
All right. We'll have all that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Lisa, awesome having you on here.
I love being on your show, and I'm so grateful that you've continued to do it for this long. It's such a commitment and dedication and service. So thank you for having me, and thank you for doing it.
You're welcome. I appreciate that. And best of health for that little kiddo.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, you too, guys.